you threaten the future. And that's exactly the case with humanity, why women have that eschatological or future-oriented feature. And it's also why we consider men who make women die for them cowards and detestable slime. Because men are the ones who go do that. So Christ lays down his life. There could never have been a Jessica Christ because men are by nature that type of creature, the laying down of the life, the leading, the gardener, and women are the ones who come and help the man accomplish that task, without which he couldn't do it.
Welcome to the Plain Speech Podcast. My name is Michael Clary. I've got a great conversation for you today that I think you're really going to enjoy with Shane Morris. Shane is the host of the Upstream podcast, which is part of the Colson Center. And he has written some very helpful and insightful posts on Facebook and Twitter that go viral for all the right reasons, meaning that they're super sharp and insightful, but controversial because he's addressing things that go against the cultural norms and prevailing wisdom in our society. But he's dead on accurate in what he points out, and we talk about one of those viral posts in the episode that I've got for you today, and I read like pretty much the whole thing just to get his reaction to it and talk about it, because when I first read it, it was super helpful and very insightful. So you're going to really enjoy that, and the whole conversation is just packed with so many great insights. Shane also is speaking at our conference, the King's Domain Gendered Virtue Men and Women Who Take Dominion Conference, that's coming up this April 18 through 20 in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I would love just for you to consider coming to that. We want to invite you personally. It's not a huge conference, so you'll have plenty of opportunities to meet Shane and the other speakers, which are Michael Foster, Joe Rigney, Toby Sumpter, among others that will be speaking at the conference. So you have a chance to meet some of these leaders and interact with them. And I think you'll also be really edified by the fellowship, just getting to know other people that are like-minded. So consider coming out to the conference. It's pretty inexpensive too, because we've done everything we can to keep the price down. The price is $119 per person. And men and women of all life stages and ages will be edified and challenged and are welcome to come. And we have set aside Friday night of the conference for a singles mixer. And that's just another way to meet people in a similar life stage and make some friends. And hopefully that will be really fun and encouraging for you as well. So if you want to find out more information about the conference, you can go to genderedvirtue.com, and that's got a schedule, the details, and you can register there. Thanks a lot and enjoy this episode. I'm excited to have Shane Morris on the Plain Speech Podcast with me today. Thanks for being here, Shane.
So glad to be here, Michael. Thanks for the invite.
My pleasure. To start us off, I'd like to ask you about some of your Facebook posts, in particular ones where you're going out on the beach, swimming around, and collecting seashells. And the question that I want to ask you is, don't you know that you're wasting your life?
Yes, I've heard that for a number of years. In fact, it's kind of a new Calvinist bona fide, right, to not waste your life by collecting seashells. But you see, I'm not only a disciple in bygone days of John Piper and desiring God. By the way, that's the source of that for anyone who doesn't know, the wasting your life by collecting seashells remark. I forget what sermon it was in, but it was, it's a famous thing from him.
It was a Passion Conference. I believe that was
Passion Conference. Yeah. Well, I'm not only a disciple of that way of thinking, but I'm also a disciple of Joe Rigney's way of thinking. This was one of your recent guests, I believe. Joe has been a friend of mine for a while. He was my first ever guest on my podcast with the Colson Center, Upstream. And he has sort of extended and elucidated further the, I guess, Christian hedonism, desiring God message to point out that not only do we seek God above all things, right? But once we got that order of loves in place, that we can actually pursue earthly gifts with great joy and celebration and thanksgiving to God. And I think that, as a Floridian, I'm genuinely persuaded that seashells are one of his most stunning gifts, and time in nature is as well. So as long as you got your loves in order, I think you're fine to go ahead and collect those seashells or shark teeth or whatever it is that floats your boat.
Yeah, I've seen like your pictures. Like the shark teeth are huge. What you find, it's like are those real?
Yeah.
Like that's amazing.
100% real. Yeah, we've got some rich fossil beds here in Florida, and megalodon is one of the species that kind of gets represented. So they pop out underwater or sometimes on the land because Florida, as a low-lying landmass, was basically seabed for a while. So the megalodon teeth are all here, and they pop out in various conditions, and it's always a thrill to find them. So it's just been a hobby of mine since I was a kid.
Yeah, sounds like a fun one. Well, okay, so all joking aside, the conference that you're speaking at, we invited Shane to come to speak at the King's Domain Conference. That's April 18 through 20, Cincinnati, Ohio. The theme is gendered virtue. And I invited Shane to come on the podcast because of things that I'd seen him write and speak about in other places. And then the title of the conference, Gendered Virtue, suggests something that I've heard also you riff on before, Shane, and this is where I'd love to kind of hear you unpack more. That the title, Gendered Virtue, it indicates that men and women have unique wirings, or the ontology of male and female. If you want to weigh in on that, that's fine. But I'm thinking in particular, it's like we are ontologically human, but we are a dyad, or we're not the same. There's two kinds of human. And one of the things that I heard you say, and I wish I could track this down because I heard you say this on a podcast. It's been 2 or 3 years ago. You said something that stood out to me so strongly that I ended up including it in my book about sexuality. And you said that God gave men something of a protological, either orientation. It's like there's something protological about men and something eschatological about women. And I thought that was a beautiful way to depict what God has done, that it made me delight in God when I heard that. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on those things.
Well, there are all kinds of biblical resonances that lead me to that conclusion, or I think suggest that conclusion to me. But if we back up, I think it's important to say that the reason we're having this discussion, the reason that you guys want to have this conference, the reason that it's such a hot topic around the nation and throughout our culture, is that we are living in the great age of anthropological heresies. So if you look at church history, since Christ ascended to the right hand of the Father, you'll notice various eras of heresies. So there are the heresies in theology proper. There are the heresies in Christology. There are the heresies in ecclesiology, in soteriology. And then, you move through church history and each head of doctrine gets successively questioned and then clarified. Well, Michael, I think we're in the age of anthropological heresies, which means that the thing being questioned right now is the doctrine of man, or of humanity. What is human nature? What are male and female? What part do our bodies play in our selfhood? Do we have a nature even that directs us toward certain rational ends, or are we just self-determining creatures that can sort of nominalistically create our own ends? To use the famous philosophical dictum, the reversal of the traditional way of putting it, that existence precedes essence, right? That's kind of that I think it's a Nietzschean idea, basically. It's existential in any case, that you exist, but then you decide what kind of thing you are, as opposed to the classical way of framing it, which is you are a certain type of thing, and your existence is the process of either living into that or distorting that. Well, I think that's what we see with the issue of male and female. And the reason I say that there's something protological or creationly about masculinity or about men, and something eschatological or consummationly, end of timesly, new heavens, new earthly, whatever adverb you want to make out of it, about women, is that it kind of goes back to 1 Corinthians 11. You can talk about it there. And in that passage, Paul says, as part of his reasoning for order in worship, he says that men were created first. He says that man was not taken from woman, but woman was taken from man. And that man was created directly by God. And this is, part of the testimony in Genesis of how God created human beings. That man is the original bearer of His image, and then woman is a glorification or a derivation of that image. So she's like the next step up. But she points towards something, because the man in himself doesn't have the capacity to to do anything but live his own life and work his own plot of ground, right? But she points toward generations to come. And when the fall takes place and sin enters the world, it's not through the man that redemption will come, but it's actually through God points to the woman, and he says it'll be her seed, which, as I understand it, is kind of a weird term because we usually associate seed with men, not with women. But her issue, there will be a child that comes from her indirectly that will redeem the world. And I think that's what we see fulfilled most prominently in the virgin birth, obviously. A new man, a new Adam coming from a virgin without the involvement of a man. But we see it also in the life of the church, and then in the characterization of the church as a bride. I think the church is not characterized as a new Adam. Jesus is the new Adam. Church is characterized as his bride, and that tells me that he is going to bring forth something from her that is designed to fill the new heavens and new earth. That her issue, her disciples, her children are going to be the seed that was promised to. Already are in a sense, but will eventually become in a consummated way the seed that was promised to Abraham, and ultimately back to Adam in the proto-evangelion. So there's a lot more we could say, but I look at that dyad of creation and the new creation as symbolized in many ways in men and women, and of course we need each other, and that's the part of the point of redemption, is that it's not a starting over, it's not something new, that women are actually that the new creation is a derivation or a redemption or a bringing to glory of the first creation, right? Grace doesn't destroy nature, it perfects nature. And I think that's similar to what we see mirrored or pictured in marriage and the sexes.
Yeah, I just love the imagery and the beauty of that, because you see the Bible, the story starts with a man in a garden, but it ends with a bride in a city, a New Jerusalem.
Yes.
A consummated, glorified fulfillment of where it began, and the trajectory of all of humanity is pushed along through successive motherhood. Even all through the Old Testament, you just have the great struggle of this hope of the seed that was to come, but it was challenged by infertility, barrenness, other sorts of deviations from God's plan. But what I love about that is it breaks the perception that God looks down on women, and femininity is this secondary thing that I don't know anybody that thinks that now, but that's the perception that easily kind of enters into the water with Christian discussion. But what we see in the Bible is that there is a unique glory that belongs to women and a unique glory that belongs to men. And the whole concept of gendered virtue is that I've heard this so many times where, well, there's only one fruit of the Spirit. There's not like a masculine list and a feminine list. I'm like, well, in a sense, that is true. But there is masculine love, masculine joy, masculine, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. Yeah, it's like there are masculine ways of expressing those and feminine way of expressing those. But what we have in our day now is like everything is on the inside, it's all neuter, and then there's just a little bit of plumbing differences externally, and that's all that matters. But the downstream effects of that have been catastrophic, it seems.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the reason that we have these confusions, it's not an accident. I mean, there have been a number of accounts that have explained how we got here. I think of Abigail Favali's The Genesis of Gender. I had her on Upstream a while back. I think of Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And both of these trace some of the contours of the same story from different directions and through different stretches of history. But the story essentially is that we got divorced from our bodies, that somehow whether it was ideological or technological or chemical or some kind of combination between those things, plausibility structures came into place that made it very, very easy for us to decide or even just assume accidentally that the true us is something other than our bodies. Not that it is more than our bodies, which is part of what Christianity teaches, but that it's wholly other than our bodies, and that our bodies are in some way really irrelevant to that. And obviously your body is the most obvious, it's the most plain place where you can see that gendered distinction between male and female. I like what C.S. Lewis does in the Space Trilogy, where he distinguishes between masculinity and maleness, and femininity and femaleness. So he says that the male and female are sort of the archetypes of masculine and feminine transposed into a biological key, which is a marvelous way of thinking about it. But we are biological creatures. We are embodied creatures, and the Bible is among all the documents of ancient history, among the most adamant in affirming that our bodies are good, that they're not an accident, they're not the flotsam of some kind of battle between the primordial gods or titans, or like an offspring of an illicit affair of some kind. No, they actually good, the good creations and beautiful work of God's hands, and he meant us to be in these bodies, and then he created us male and female, and that dyad emerges before the fall because God had an intention for it. Well, we have through our technology and our ideology come to decide that the real us is inside somewhere. It's subjective, it's internal, it's spiritual, it's psychological, however you want to put it. This is how you get that language of someone being born into the wrong body, right? As if a body is a sort of, it's like the ghost in the machine imagery. Yeah, it's a prison house, right? Which is that Platonic language, and I'm a big fan of Plato. I think it's marvelous, and I think there's a Christian way to take that, as many Christian Platonists would say. In fact, I asked Hans Boersma exactly that question when he was on Upstream. I asked him, how do you escape this charge that guys like N.T. Wright will make, that Platonism sort of flows right naturally into the modern mind-body dualism? And he said, well, it just you don't need to understand that way, because he doesn't think it originally, he takes it in a more Lewisian direction, right? Because Lewis called himself a Platonist. But all of that, I think, is the picture that emerges. And you asked how we got here. Well, it's a long story, but I think the crux of it is we divorced ourselves from our bodies. And now we view our bodies as mainly playthings or clay to be sculpted, or ways of individualistically expressing ourselves, but not necessarily something innate about us that says something about who we are and what God intends and expects of us in this life. But they are biblically.
Yeah, for sure. That the whole existence precedes essence, or essence precedes existence idea that you were talking about there reminds me of this. There's another thing an illustration that I've toyed with before, which is whenever the fullness of time came for God to be born of a woman and incarnate into humanity, did he have two equally suitable types of body to it that he could have inhabited? And to tease it out a little bit further, it's like, what would we think if Jesus Christ was actually Jessica Christ? And she grew up as a young woman, and then she had her 12 female disciples, and then there's it's like, this is, if we just totally invert everything, it's like there's something hopefully within us that would recoil and think like, that is crazy, that is so weird and bizarre, not merely because it's different than what we're used to, but something fundamental is weird there. And as tragic as the crucifixion is, it is a tragedy that corresponds with what we think of heroic sacrifice of men.
Yes.
But to think of a woman laying down her life for men and for all of humanity, that there's just we think of women as the one who gave us life. And even the feminine represents, as you say, the future. The feminine represents life. So it's like the church is the bride of Christ, and the church also is our mother. So it's motherhood represents this fullness in life, and that is a glory and a beauty that God has given uniquely to women. And what I see in the modern world is an attack. Like, feminism is like an attack on true femininity, and it seeks to empower women by twisting and distorting them and making them more manly, such that men become more like women become more like men. And the result of that is, well, you have a diminishing reproduction because it doesn't work. It doesn't fit. And that, to me, I'm like, it's a brilliant satanic strategy, because what we end up with is is less fruitful and maybe ultimately unfruitful humanity. That it's like, if you attack the feminine, then you're attacking humanity itself. It's another way of attacking humanity itself.
Does
That makes
not
sense.
even nature teach is Paul's phrase. And what he's alluding to there is that there are things about men and women that actually teach us about the unique callings or vocations that God has for the sexes. So the question, could Jesus Christ have been Jessica Christ, is really actually one that C.S. Lewis asks in his essay, Priestesses in the Church, right? Where he says, what you're doing, you need to be honest about what you're doing, because folks who want women to be ordained as priests, what you're really doing is asking us to radically re-envision what Christianity is, to rework the whole faith, because it's not just a matter of interchangeable people with technical skills who can execute this office of priesthood, right? The priest is a father. He's a father figure.
That's right.
He's the highest up level of priest. A bishop is in ancient times called a patriarch, right? And or the archbishop is, and that is as a representative of Christ as the father figure that Isaiah refers to. A wonderful counselor, everlasting Father, mighty God, right? And then he himself is the image of the invisible God who is known as Father. He says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So all up, the hierarchy of spiritual ministers and authorities, Christianity is a patriarchal religion. And we don't have to be afraid of that word. Patriarchal just means father rule. And literally, we worship God the Father. That is how he most explicitly identifies. So we are ruled by a father. To then say that women can equally represent that father as a man who corresponds to the male savior who chose 12 male disciples to carry his message out and represent it to the world, is to say something fundamental about the character of the faith, and then to rewrite by extension something fundamental about nature, that men are actually the ones who are designed to initiate, to lead, to protect, to sacrifice, to go out, take dominion, and that the woman is the one who is the fit helper or the partner in that process. And the main way she does that, of course, in the context of Genesis, is through reproduction. Right? She makes more people. He can't make more people himself. And if you just look at it on an objective level, Michael, I wrote something a while back where I pointed to the Voyager space probes that I think were sent out in the 1970s, if I remember correctly. And the probes were equipped with a plaque, a little bronze plaque on them, in case they ran into space aliens, right? And it had some basic things on it, like here are a bunch of prime numbers. Here's our planet in relation to other planets. So they gave a roadmap back. So hopefully the aliens that find it are nice. But the other thing they included on there was a little picture of a naked man and a woman, right? And because they wanted the extraterrestrial, the hypothetical extraterrestrial life to know what we looked like, what our species looked like. And the thing that stands out when you look at that engraving is how different they are, how very, very different they are. And the woman in particular, obviously, I mean, this is one of the facts of life. So much of her body is actually designed around the capacity to reproduce. For men, it's almost negligible, right?
Yeah.
It's like almost everything about our physical forms is designed to go do stuff, right? And we just have forms that are optimal for strength and speed and endurance and things like that. We've accomplished tasks. And then we've got a rather negligible reproductive system tacked on. For women, almost everything is built around the reproduction. And this is something that extends beyond humans even. There's a reason that hunters don't go take does. Because if you take does on a regular basis, I mean, happens once in a while, you got to fill the meat freezer, right? But for the most part, you're not after the does. Number one, because it's not a trophy in the same way a buck with a nice rack of antlers is, right? But number two, because if you kill the does, there won't be any more deer next season.
You threaten the future.
You threaten the future, and that's exactly the case with humanity. Why women have that eschatological or future-oriented feature, and it's also why we consider men who make women die for them cowards and detestable slime. Because men are the ones who go do that. So Christ lays down his life. There could never have been a Jessica Christ because men are by nature that type of creature, the laying down of the life, the leading, the gardener, and women are the ones who come and help the man accomplish that task, without which he couldn't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So many good points there that I have to discipline my mind because I want to go in 100 different directions. But you talked about just if you shoot a doe, you're shooting the future. It's like you're not only killing that one animal, but you're killing all the potential deer that may be born from her. But if you kill a buck, well, there's another buck that'll mate with her. So it's there's a less of a cost involved, and so the female body it's like God has given men and women vocations that correspond to our sex, but the woman's vocation is biologically integrated in such a way that she can see within her own body what her vocation is. Not singular vocation, but a primary vocation. The thing for which the female form was made was oriented towards children. But
and
for
as Alan Keyes pointed out in this clip that is currently kind of going viral, it's from a while back. It's a show he was on with Barack Obama back in I guess probably in the early 2000s. And Keyes is asked about marriage, and he says, well, contrary to Senator Obama, I think that marriage is between a man and a woman intrinsically. And he points to this distinction between the actuality and the potentiality of a body to reproduce. And he said, so reproduction is essential to marriage, the potential to it. Without that potential, you can't have marriage. And the host, thinking he's super clever, says, I forget who it was. He thinks he's super clever, and he's like, well, Alan, what about couples who are too old to reproduce, too old to have kids? What about those post-menopause? And Keyes just sort of like sighs and rolls his eyes and goes, okay, well, let me give you a natural law lesson here between the difference between something that's impossible in principle and something that's only impossible by or highly unlikely by accident, right? Something that has happened to you, whether it's age or injury or whatever. And in that, I think we can say something universal about men and women that you can't say about other sorts of distinctions. Even a man and woman who are past childbearing age are characterized by their sexual complementarity and the potential to reproduce. Even a man who is not married, a woman who is not married, are characterized by that potential, that built-in potential in their bodies. And they will do everything they do in their lives as a potential father or a potential mother. I think they will mother and father the world inevitably in ways that they're not even aware of, even if they don't have kids. That's part of why I think the fur baby phenomenon comes in. People are mothering the world even without kids, right? They just find something to mother and go crazy with it. But that's, that just shows that there's something really fundamental here. And what you're saying, Michael, is true of men and women who don't have kids or who are not married. And that's so important to understand because we live in an age where people are super confused about particularities and generalizations. Like every generalization is treated as an overgeneralization, but that's not true. Generalizations are how we make sense of the world. They're necessary in order to understand anything. There are true generalizations, and the exceptions do not disprove them. The pathology or the age or the brokenness does not disprove what a man and woman are. It certainly doesn't prove that a man and a man can get married or a woman and a woman can get married. That's in principle nonsense, which was Keyes' insight.
My great-grandparents got married when they were young, and they stayed true to their wedding vows for 74 years. They lived long enough to meet some of my children, which was their great-great-grandchildren. Unfortunately, healthy Christian households like this have become an endangered species, and Christian understanding of sexuality is often more catechized by the world than informed by a biblical worldview. And so as a result, we have increasing numbers of Christians who lack a proper understanding of masculinity, femininity, and the beauty of God's good design. And so Christians who want to obey God's design for sexuality still need guidance from faithful leaders. To address this need, King's Domain Ministries in Cincinnati, Ohio has invited an incredible lineup of speakers to our annual conference. This year, the theme is called Gendered Virtue, Men and Women Who Take Dominion. The lineup of speakers includes Michael Foster, Joe Rigney, Toby Sumpter, Shane Morris, and others. And our desire is to help men and women know why God created the sexes the way He did, how we can live virtuously and harmoniously with each other, and how all of this is for God's glory and our good. I'm confident that everybody who attends this conference will leave with three things: other than the sweet t-shirt and the other swag that we'll give you. Number 1, a biblical blueprint for establishing Christian households that last for generations. Number 2, practical application for men and women from experienced ministers of the gospel. And number 3, tangible steps that you can take to move forward in your specific situation. This conference is intended for men and women, single or married, or whether or not you have children. You will certainly benefit from the teaching and fellowship that you will experience at this conference. I would love to have you here, and I'd love to meet you personally. We've done everything we can to keep the cost low, so it's only $129 per person. If you want to find out more information and register, just go to genderedvirtue.com. I look forward to seeing you there. I think that there's a couple thoughts that are connecting in my mind. One is about homosexuality and one is about contraception. And I'd like to move toward contraception next as kind of a resistance to, if not rebellion against, the female function. But prior to that is, we see these harsh condemnations of homosexuality in Scripture. I think Paul makes it clear in Romans chapter 1 that it is a rebellion against nature. It is suppressing what is natural and giving yourself over to something unnatural. But I think what makes it unnatural is not merely that you're joining parts of the body together that were not meant to be joined, but because of how sex between a man and woman work, that tells you how the bodies are supposed to fit together, and doing something unnatural to that does not have the intended effect. So to say it another way, homosexuality is probably, I think of it as like the first form of contraception. It's like if you want to have sex with somebody without the risk of getting them pregnant, well, then you have sex with somebody who, in a part of his body that cannot possibly produce another human life.
Right.
But it's a way of fulfilling sexual pleasure without having to grapple with the consequence of it. And so that leads me to the thing about contraception. And for what it's worth, I have the tweet. You probably know the one I'm talking about. The tweet that you wrote is a thread just about contraception and how we have so internalized this idea of sex without consequence enabled by the pill that it has shaped the way we understand humanity itself. So here's the question. The pill is kind of a worldview amplifier, the birth control pill.
Yes.
And it's distorted our understanding of reality and sexuality. So I have the tweet available if you'd like me to. I could just read it all, but I figured you may be able to just.
Because it's been a hot minute since I posted that. I
Okay.
need to remember what I said.
All right, so this is long. It'll take me 2-3 minutes to read it, but this is so good. So we vastly underestimate the extent to which debates over gender roles, even within the church, are founded on the presumption that sex can be reliably had without producing babies. The sheer fact of birth control has thrown even Christians into a world of artificial confusion here. And if you want to jump in, Shane, feel free. Should a woman build a career or be a mom? What city will she live in? How much education will she pursue? Should she date around or settle and get married? How many kids should she have? What standard of living does she demand? What will her work-home balance be with her partner? Take away the drugs and devices used to artificially suppress her reproductive system, and a stunning number of these questions simply answer themselves. People's whole mental landscape about sex changes because it's no longer some self-expressive game. It's the origin of life. We have this dumb modern conceit that our great-grandparents were prudes with their modesty standards and shotgun weddings. They were not. Sex made babies back then. Do you really understand that? To even think of fooling around was to invite a cascade of life-altering events. Man, this is so good. We've forgotten this because the spell of contraception has so altered our worldview that we don't even understand our bodies anymore. When young people today, even in the church, say they're not sure they want kids, they are almost never saying they're not sure they want sex. They're saying they want to chemically isolate the very beginning of the human reproductive cycle so they can dwell in maximal gratification indefinitely while pursuing idealized middle-class hobbies and status symbols. They just need the right buddy or roommate for it. I've seen Christian young people get married with this mentality without even the intention or openness to having kids. We all have. What we don't often realize is what an absolutely bizarre and unnatural frame of mind this is, and how dependent it is on technology. For almost all of human history, the choice was celibacy or babies. Those limits were very good for us in some very important ways. Marriage and exclusivity flowed naturally out of them, together with culturally appropriate gender roles. Marriage really is natural. I'm getting to the end here. Now, those roles and even marriage itself looks incredibly quaint and arbitrary, so much so that many delude themselves into thinking they actually are arbitrary. But they're not. They're deeply fitted into the grooves of human nature and have honed us for millennia. The tie between sex and babies has shaped our households, our clans, our clothes, our legal system, our economies, our nations, our civilization, our psyches. And in about a single generation, we broke that tie. What did we think would happen? Barring some sort of collapse, that tie will, of course, not be reestablished in the foreseeable future. Sex will continue to mean subjective things other than babies, but it is critical that we understand that we are the products of an iron link between sex and reproduction. Our medical and chemical wizardry may prevent contraception, but it cannot change our natures. The pain, questions, confusion, and chaos surrounding sex and gender today are largely, I am increasingly convinced, the result of an innovation we didn't realize would subtly destroy us. There's the one more paragraph here where you mention a few names that everybody may not know.
Right.
The thought that comes to my mind is we are talking about suicide at a species level because of this.
Suicide at a spiritual level, in how we deal with our relationships and sex, and we see that, I think, in the explosion of mental health problems and what several authors have argued, Mary Eberstadt most prominently, is the source of the sexual revolution and all the confusion we see today in the LGBT movement. Even is the breakdown and destruction of the family, and how that's actually at the source of the great de-churching as well, or one of the major factors. People aren't raised in families. All of that goes back, I think, to the ability to divorce ourselves from our bodies and the brute facts, the beautiful facts, but if you mistreat them, brute facts that enforce themselves upon us because of our embodied nature. Our, like this gentleman said so well,
so
our embodied nature.
Articulated.
Yes, I couldn't say it better than that. So you ever read something you wrote before and you're like, oh man, wow, that was really good. I don't know if I'm up to that level anymore. You just get a moment of inspiration and it goes. I think I just read a book or something.
I just want to bask in the glow of my brilliance here.
Let's have a moment of silence. And I think that tweet actually generated quite a bit of heat online as well from people who didn't agree with it. But I still believe every word of it, and I have seen things since that have reinforced that even more fully. And I think a lot of people who get mad at that sort of thing understand on a deep gut level how right it is, but they're upset about that, and they need some rationalization to fix it for them when they find themselves like having thrown away their 20s and early 30s, coming up on infertility essentially by age, and realizing that they spent their lives on something they didn't want to spend it on, and all they have is cats. Like, this is especially a potent problem for women for obvious reasons. But you notice this in weird places. Like, I was a big fan of Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. I read all 14 books, including the ones by Brandon Sanderson as he finishes it up. It's like the biggest slog in fantasy, modern fantasy. And I hate the Amazon adaptation. It's trash. Don't even turn it on. But the one of the things that I didn't like about it, Jordan's books, it was just kind of funny, was there are a number of moments when key characters shack up. And there's no like explicit scenes or anything. It's not pornographic, but he's clear about the fact that they did shack up. And hardly anybody ever gets pregnant. That's one of the funny parts about it. Like these are young, healthy, fertile individuals, right? In this story. And they're just, you see this in things like Game of Thrones too, right? Everyone's just constantly shacking up and hardly anybody ever gets pregnant. Now, I think if you talk to any like OBGYN or gynecologist or something, they'll tell you there's a really high chance of pregnancy when you do these things. And the fact that you think that this sort of casual encounter, even if a pregnancy does result, right? The sort of nonchalance with which the female characters waltz into the situation. Historically speaking, that's a very big deal. People fornicated before birth control, but they often paid a really hefty price for it. Or if they weren't willing to, they made the child pay a hefty price for it, which is why you find baby bones outside of brothels in archaeological digs. But the point is, sex makes babies, and that fact imposes certain strictures on our lives. You can't just go around, as the author of another novel I recently read, planting seeds in every woman who strikes your fancy as a man. And that responsibility historically rested primarily on men because they were seen as having like power, which they do physically. And that's why fathers were so protective of their daughters. That's why the father gives away the daughter and so forth at the wedding. I mean, all these patriarchal rituals that we look at and we think in our grandparents, that's either quaint or offensive. Many of them were in place just because sex made babies. And now that sex doesn't make babies, we have this bizarre, historically untethered mentality that we can just engage in these recreational encounters without consequences, and that sex itself is a kind of recreational pastime. I don't know. This may be going out on a limb, Michael, but I don't know if you were to show. It would be evil to do this, but if you were to go back in time and show someone from like Abraham Lincoln's time, Pornhub, if you would just pull it up and show them some of the content on there, I think they would be. First of all, I think their minds might break. But second of all, I think they would be deeply disturbed for a reason that we're not, that would surprise us. And that reason is, whose family are those people? Like what are they, what's going to happen when she gets pregnant? And you would have to explain to them the idea that, oh no, in our time, sex is actually a thing that means nothing.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to mean anything. It can be just fun. Right?
Yeah.
That would have been very difficult to get them to understand. And, like if you would approach this as an evolutionary biologist, right? Which is one fun way to sort of approach these things. Like Jordan Peterson does this. I'm deeply critical of Darwinism, but if you were to approach it from that standpoint and say, look, we have evolved over millions of years to have this set of instincts, and it's driven toward the main goal of Darwinian evolution, which is passing on our genes, reproduction. Now throw the monkey wrench of, oh, we have a pill that breaks reproduction into our society. What's going to happen? We didn't change our nature overnight. We're not different creatures. We still have the same evolutionary programming. Now we're operating on, here's the example I like to use. The same biologist will point out that certain people, let's say Eskimos, right, the Inuits, evolved or developed with an intense craving for high-calorie foods. And the reason that they did this was because they live in the Arctic, and it's very hard to survive. And when there's good times, you need to put on weight fast so you can survive the winter. What happens when you throw someone who has those genes and those hormonal balances and so forth into a society where Oreo cookies exist and fried chicken and Mountain Dew? And what happens? Yeah. Well, empirically, what happens is massive obesity epidemics. And I think that's what we're seeing with sex in a different way, because that programming is not gone. It's still there, but we have broken it chemically in the modern world.
Yeah. Gravity wins. You can
always
only fight nature so long until there's reality has to reassert itself. Just like at the end of that hideous strength, reality had reasserted itself, nature reasserted itself. And because it's like God made the world one way. Dominion doesn't mean completely dismantling and recreating something according to our tastes and preferences. It is operating within the world God made and building within it, accepting things as a given and with the rules that God has in place. As you were talking about this idea that sex means nothing, it reminded me of stories in the Bible where you have, I think of Absalom sleeping with his father's concubines. There's so much messed up about the situation. The fact that David had concubines, that's messed up. But that aside, what we often think in the modern lens is it's like a Pornhub mentality. It's like, oh, Absalom was just really horny and he's found a bunch of women and just lined them up and, had sex with them all. And I'm like, no, that is an act of conquest by planting his seed in these women to reproduce his line, which would spoil his father's potential line, because that's
right.
how
And they didn't have
rulers,
paternity tests in those days, right? And
Yeah.
and he's his son, so he doesn't even have. There's not even a resemblance difference. So literally, if one of those women subsequently gets pregnant within a certain time frame, that child's identity is permanently ambiguous. And that is a threat to the kingdom. That you're exactly right. That's what he was up to there. It wasn't just epic ponage, although it kind of was that. It was also like, I'm striking at the heart of your succession.
Yeah. Yeah, and it what's fascinating to me, I've really, there have been so many things that I've experienced as a pastor and just as my own growth in Christ, where I find it's like these little closets in my mind that I'll open up the door and I'm like, oh, I did not realize that there was some feminism in there, and that feminism was living inside my mental house, and I have to deal with that, and then I have to sort of recalibrate my thinking because I had just lived and built my life upon godless pagan feminist assumptions. And now, and I'm the pastor of a church that has a lot of people younger than me. And so in some ways I'm trying to get out in front of these things before people build their mental house too far. But also our whole culture is built on these things, and they are absorbed into the thinking of people that I minister to, Gen Z and millennials and so forth. I'm Gen X, so. But it makes me think like, okay, we've got really bizarre phenomena now of just permanent elective barrenness in Christians that are like, God has called us, my wife and I, to make a lot of money and travel to Europe and not have children because they're kind of a headache. And I'm like, what in the world are you thinking? Like, and what planet did God call you to do that? Unless it's just some biological infertility, but you would choose to do like elective barrenness. I know you've got a lot of material. You've wrote a lot about this and spoken. So like, how do you see this play out?
Well, my boss, John Stonestreet, likes to point to an experience he's had a few times teaching kids at Summit. So high schoolers come out to Colorado and they do this experience. And when it comes time to talk about sex and marriage and babies as part of their curriculum, he sort of asks who here when they get married wants to have kids, and he says only a certain number will raise their hands. Right? It's not a universal sentiment among those who want to get married, and he hits them with, well, kids are part of marriage. It's a package deal. Openness to children is something that you must have if sex is something you want in your future, right? Because it's the purpose of sexual union is unitive and procreative. It's not just the one. And he said students get so riled up about this. They just get so mad because the thought that children should be something that they not only want in marriage, but that even think about before deciding to get married is just bonkers to them. It's crazy. And we've all met these couples in the church who have this sort of mentality. And there's a lot of things that flow from this and a lot of things that make it difficult to talk about. One of those that struck me a number of years ago, Michael, was that the presence of couples in Christian churches and circles who are voluntarily barren, as you put it, obscures the presence of couples who are involuntarily barren. So one of the things you see in the Bible is this, it's a theme. In many ways, the scriptures could be characterized as the story of God working through barren couples. And finally, he works through a woman who's not barren, but who is a virgin, right? So there's just nothing there that would enable him, naturally speaking, to perform that miracle, and he does so. And he does a foretaste of that in, Abraham and Sarah and the subsequent couples who are barren, which there are quite a few of them, even going into Judges. And what that tells us is that I think barrenness was something that people recognized in the surrounding culture and society, in the communities there. If a couple is like Zechariah and Elizabeth, right, is married for a long time and they don't have kids, well, what's the answer? They're barren, right? Something biologically has kept them from having kids. There's a disordered, there's a problem there physically. And so there's a great deal of compassion that is given in, especially in the law of Moses and that God-given framework for those people, because being heirless is very difficult in those days. But there's also a certain shame. So Elizabeth speaks of having a reproach. I think Hannah speaks of having a reproach or a shame, and that was the sense that you weren't blessed by God, or you didn't have offspring, and so your name was going to die. That was Isaac is seen as a blessing. The pre-Isaac life of Abraham is seen as a sort of cursed life. My body is as good as dead, is the way Hebrews puts it. And so those people were known. In today's world, you can't ask a couple. In fact, little old ladies at church get in trouble for this all the time. You can't ask a couple after a year, 2 years, 3 years of marriage, so when are you all going to have kids? Because often the retort will be, how do you know we're not infertile, right? Well, I've had couples say that, and it turns out they're not infertile. They are just being, they're just being difficult about it, because we're all victims now, right? But but it's true. You can't tell, because the infertile people are now invisible, because so many people are voluntarily barren or infertile, and that's one of the many ways that this has changed the picture. And that also prevents a great deal of natural compassion too, right? Yeah. After a while, you don't have. In the ancient world, even the world before a century or so ago, you didn't have to be told. You could have just assumed, okay, they're not having kids. Like, we need to show an extra measure of compassion here. Now you got to ask. Now you got to have an awkward conversation, because maybe they're just like you said, they're dinks and they want to tour Europe.
Yeah. No, I love that point, because the impulse that behind a lot of this for Christians is like, we want to care for people who are suffering. That's a good Christian way to love people well. And it kind of hides who's suffering. Singleness is the same thing. It's like you have some people just like, I'm not really interested in that. And that obscures the fact that there are many people who desire marriage, but for whatever reason, many legitimate reasons, they are not married yet. But it creates this environment where it's hard to see who needs care and who's in sin, who's rebellious, who's hard-hearted, and who's suffering with an obedient heart, a desire to honor God, but circumstances have, created this environment where they're just not seen. That is a really great. It's a great thing to recognize, and I think it's good for people to know that. It's like you see a circumstance, and we do. Unfortunately, we have to dig in. Have to ask some of the hard questions to find out, and that's really
by
sad.
Virtue of in the way of like being honest and upfront with people and not confusing anyone, I have questions here. I'm not entirely sure that I can get on board the Humanae Vitae stance and say that contraception is intrinsically wrong, or that all forms of it are intrinsically wrong, right? Like, I'm very suspicious. My wife is even more suspicious of the idea of chemical birth control, of actually breaking a woman's natural bodily cycles in order to, pursue infertile sex. There's a problem with that strikes me at a very visceral level. But in principle, the idea of spacing kids or doing something to do that, I'm not sure where I stand on that. I'm open to being persuaded. I really like the Catholic view. But I think the point I'm making is that as a background realization, we need to grapple with and understand how much contraception has changed our mindset about sex. And then, as Oliver O'Donovan said, I think that whether every individual sex act is equally open to conception, I think that marriage needs to be open to conception. Marriage is for having children as well as for the union of two people to help one another in life. The prophets were very clear on this, that God brought people together. I think it was Malachi, could be Micah. I always get them mixed up, right? But that God brought the two together and made them one so that they would have godly offspring. because he was seeking godly offspring. I think that's a non-negotiable of marriage. And unless you've met some barrier physically or medically that prevents that, you need to be open to that as part of your marriage. But just to, clarify that, I don't want anyone to think, well, Shane says that birth control is always intrinsically sinful. I don't know. It may be, but I'm not prepared to quite say that fully. Maybe that's the Protestantism in me holding on.
Yeah, that's a good ethical question. And the thing is, like, technology introduces new decision points that we have to grapple with. So it's like, let's say you have a life, somebody that is, let's say, like, artificially sustaining somebody's life. That's an ethical decision that enabled by technology that, 100 years ago, it's like, well, they just died because they died. And so technology can be leveraged for good things. And so being able to assert some kind of control, I think, can be a good and God honoring thing. But it's at least something to do intentionally and not just kind of accidentally trip into it,
right?
Because, like, well, everybody is on the pill. Everybody, uses contraception. And to that point, I've thought of a scripture. It's a strange text that it's especially strange, I think, to modern ears, but it's Genesis 38, where Onan,
this one.
Yeah. So, you know where I'm going with this. So, Judah was so Judah's son Onan, he had one son die, and Onan was a brother.
Right.
And so he said, like, hey, perform the duty of your brother by going into your sister-in-law and making her a wife and having children through her. And then Genesis 38, verse 9, it says, Onan knew the offspring would not be his. So physically it would be his, but symbolically and in terms of heredity and ancestry, there would at least be some question about that because he was doing it as a fulfillment of a duty to a brother.
You would raise up offspring to your brother. So that child would then carry on his brother's line despite being physically his and would inherit all of his brother's stuff. And so there's at least a plausible materialist motive here as well. That Onan may be next in line to inherit all the stuff and land, and he's not going to get it if this kid goes and carries on his brother's line.
Yeah. So it says, he went into his brother's wife. He wasted his semen on the ground so as to not give offspring to his brother. So that's like way, way, way ancient form of contraception, which just pull out. That prevented the child. And that was the next verse is what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death. God killed him for wasting his semen on the ground. Now, was it because of the economic motive? Was it because he was depriving a potential life from happening? That wouldn't point to that. I don't believe that every sex act should be potentially conceptive, but I certainly believe every marriage should be, and to be as fruitful as is reasonable. Because, like, there's a whole other conversation about how there are so many unusual constraints in modern life that it's like there are more obstacles to overcome. So society doesn't support larger families. Even think about seatbelt laws have had a downstream effect of how many children people have. Right. I have 4 children, and that was like a deliberate thing that my wife and I chose. And I've since thought back on that. My wife is totally cool with what like stopping at 4, but ever since then I've thought, did we do that right? And that's a thing that I'm like, I trust the grace of God in areas where I may have erred. But in either case, we got to let the Bible speak, and for us to receive the voice of God through Scripture and say, okay, do we need grace here? Are we obedient, disobedient? And at the very least, elective barrenness we have to at least go that far. Elective barrenness in a marriage is sinful and wrong.
The story of Onan in Genesis illustrates a number of things, but it's the breaking of faith. It's the disobeying of a custom that had the force of law. It is, it's lying. There may be an element of him just wanting to have a good time in there as well, but primarily, right? It's that separation of the of sex. Sex's duty as force of reproduction in a levirate context, which is in the ancient world. This is how you basically make sure people are provided for. So this is like the this is the woman's retirement plan in essence.
Yeah.
is to have a kid, is to have an heir. So it's not a trivial thing. It's very necessary. And to take that away, it illustrates the importance that sex had and reproduction had in those times, and then subsequently for millennia, all the way up until very recent times, because it served all of these important roles. The modern economy, in ways that are both morally neutral and I think morally suspect, has severed that link and made it possible for us to think in different ways. And so one of the morally neutral ways would be like seatbelt laws. Okay, the fact that you can't, like you said, the fact that you can't squeeze 12 children into a car, put a bunch in the trunk or whatever, like our grandparents all did, is it limits things. So you had to buy a bunch of expensive approved seatbelts and cut the straps when they've been in an accident or whatever. That piles up after a while. It makes things a little bit more difficult. The fact that our economy has shifted from an agrarian mode to an industrialized mode has changed a lot of that too. That's also a morally neutral thing. So once upon a time, children were an asset. To have more and more children meant you had more and more farmhands, so you could work more land, so you could make more profits, so you could buy more, and pretty soon you dominate all your neighbors just because you had many sons, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now, children are a financial liability because you got to pay for food, and you got to pay for housing, you got to pay for college. Then pretty soon it all stacks up, and the average American looks at it and says, "I can't do this. I'm going to be destitute if I try," because children don't net you anything anymore. So those are just considerations. Birth control is one of those that slides into the morally suspect region, because what do we do? We're directly attacking that connection between sex and babies, and I don't think we, like Ian Malcolm said in Jurassic Park, and has been quoted a billion times. We were so preoccupied with whether or not we didn't stop to think if we should. And there, as in Jurassic Park, I think are unintended consequences to this science.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, this is so good. I want to try to squeeze in one more question if I can.
Sure.
So are you millennial? What do you have?
Yes, I'm 35.
Okay.
I was born in 1988.
When you think of a millennial generation and maybe the generation that you're raising and pastors and that sort of thing, what message would you think? Let's say you have a pastor that's like, Shane, I've got a church full of young kids and I want to really equip them for the future. Do you have a certain message or talking point that you would tell them, hey, make sure you hit these notes?
Yeah, the biggest one on this topic is don't preach rules without reasons. You need to talk about anthropology, and don't be scared by that word. It just means don't root your teaching in arbitrarily selected biblical proof texts. This is one of the things I think people radically and dangerously misunderstand about the Bible in the modern evangelical context. The Bible is not written as a sort of exhaustive instruction manual for life. It's not. It doesn't address a whole range of topics in a direct and specific way. It lays down general precepts and tells the story of the creation, fall, redemption, and restoration of the world. And then it gives us what we need for that the man of God may be thoroughly equipped for the tasks related to, preaching salvation and teaching the church. All of that is in Scripture, and a lot else besides that's incidental, but it's not exhaustive. Scripture, instead, if you read it from cover to cover, it constantly assumes that you will be familiar as the reader with the general revelation in God's world, that truths that are apparent and evident and deducible from the things that are created will be in your mind. The Bible itself is written, so it assumes at the very most basic level that you have learned to read. The Bible does not teach you how to read. It's not like that scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where the two comic relief henchmen are floating in the little boat, and he's reading one has a Bible in front of him, and the guy's like, "You can't even read," and he's like, "It's the Bible. You get points for trying." It's not like that. It doesn't actually help you read. You have to learn to read the Bible, which means you have to consult, practically speaking, general revelation before you consult special revelation, at least if there's no one talking to you or telling you things about it. And that, I think, is something the Bible assumes throughout. Those phrases that Paul uses, for instance, does not even nature teach, where he says the law is written on the Gentiles' hearts so that they do the requirements of the law without even having the written law, where where it says that they're without excuse because of the things that are created, that God's existence and his power are evident to them. All these things that the Bible says are evident and that you should know them. It expects you to know them. So I think when we talk about male and female, which is in many ways one of the most evident truths accessible to us on a daily basis as human beings, right? We see it every time we look in the face of the opposite sex. We see it every time we disrobe to get in the shower. I mean, for real. We see it every time we look at a baby. We see it, it's all over our world, and it should be obvious to us. And to rebel against something that's obvious is not a failure to read Scripture as much as it's a failure to just open your eyes and look at the world around you and accept what you're seeing. It's a willful blindness to reality. And so I don't think when asked questions about something like transgenderism, pastors or teachers should go immediately to Scripture. I think we need to be very careful with that. I think we can eventually go to Scripture as the capstone of our argument and say, and that is why the Bible says, in the beginning, he created them male and female, just like Jesus does. But of course, Jesus is speaking to this audience that claims to care about what Genesis says. In many cases, we're speaking to an audience that doesn't claim to care about that. And so our task is really, it's more than just quote the Bible, although it has power in and of itself. I think our task is to show that the world that the Bible describes is actually the world that we live in and that we ourselves are part of. And that those two fit together beautifully. The Bible tells the truth because it matches the world, not just because we have this, arbitrary commitment to it being true. And then maybe I'll step on some presuppositional toes there, but I really do think that that God speaks in general and he speaks in particular, and the two are united. They tell the same story if properly understood. And I think people need to hear that because there's this suspicion, very strong suspicion in the hearts of many modern people that Scripture is irrelevant to reality and that it doesn't actually tell the story that of the true world, that it's a fantasy world in essence. We need to show them that it does. So yeah, don't give rules without reasons. Give the reasons.
I love that. God wrote 2 books. He wrote Nature and His Word also, and they're not at odds with each other. That's a good word to end it on. What would be good for us to know as far as follow your material? You do the Upstream podcast. You work for Colson Center.
Yes.
How should what should people know to follow you?
Yeah, colsoncenter.upstream.org. I'm sorry, scratch that. Upstream.colsoncenter.org. The other one might work too, but that one's the one that I'm supposed to send people to. That's going to be how you get to the podcast, which is my creative outlet for just about all the conversations that I really want to have with authors that I'm super excited to talk to. Like I've got upcoming here an episode. I'm going to record it later this week with Andrew Spencer. He wrote a book called Hope for God's Creation, which is it's about Christian environmentalism or stewardship of creation. So it's kind of like, how do we not become hippies, but also care about the environment? And this is a subject that I love, I love and care about dearly. So that's just one of the many things that we address. Really, Upstream is about, it's about going back to the sources of true ideas and false ideas, and then identifying those sources, hence the name Upstream. It's kind of an ad fontes thing. And then colsoncenter.org or breakpoint.org, you'll find the daily commentary, which I am one of the main writers for, and John Stonestreet hosts that, and he'll mention when one of them is my commentary.
Great. Fantastic, Shane. I really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit, and I can't wait to meet you face to face and have you at the conference, but thank you very much for being with us today.
Same. Thanks for having me, brother.
Well, thank you for tuning in to the Plain Speech podcast. Don't forget to register and plan on coming. Just personal invitation for you to come. You can meet Shane and some of the other great speakers we have. The King's Domain Conference, Gendered Virtue, Men and Women Who Take Dominion. You can find out about that at genderedvirtue.com. And we'll see you next time.